Hello everyone, welcome to Act 2, Scene 3, Part 2 of Macbeth. And this is the second part of the lesson. So after the porter has said his lewd, rude intervention, we now move on. But before we do that, please, you need to have three things in front of you. The first thing is this video that you're watching. The second thing is the document, which looks like this. And the third thing is the actual scene and the translation into modern day English within SparkNotes. So if you click on this link here, it will take you to this page. So go ahead and have those three things open in front of you, perhaps in three separate browsers. But first things first, let's start off with some terminology. This is a piece of terminology that you should be familiar with. Dramatic irony. What is it? Well, it's a literary technique originally used in the Greek tragedy, which is the full significance of a character's words or actions is clear to the audience, but not necessarily clear to the character. So the audience knows what's going on, but the character doesn't necessarily know what's going on. This is going to be important when we are studying this part of the play, but also it's just generally important when appreciating drama. When you think back to Inspector Calls, when Mr. Burling says the Titanic is absolutely sinkable and nobody wants war apart from the Germans, that's a good example of dramatic irony. So go ahead, pop your definition into here, into this part of your document, or into your creative notebook, curator's notebook if you have it, and pop down the definition now. So we should already know what happens in this scene, as we took notes of it last lesson. But in a nutshell, the knocking that ended scene 2 continues. The porter, as we know, provides some comic relief after the murder of Duncan, and complains about the effects of alcohol. That was last lesson. Macduff arrives to wake up the king. This is what we're going to be looking at this lesson. Macbeth allows him to enter the chambers, where he finds the body of the king and raises the alarm. Obviously, chaos ensues. Macbeth kills the guards, who he persuades everybody else is responsible for the death of the king. And Duncan's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, decide to go to Ireland and to England. Malcolm goes to England and Donalbain goes to Ireland. What I suggest you do, though, is re-watch this video, which is a good sort of step-by-step analysis of what happens within this particular important scene, and remind yourself of what it is that goes on within this scene. So we'll begin looking at the second half of this scene today. Before we do, I would like you to think back to last lesson and to think of the term that we used to describe ambiguous language that is used to conceal the truth. Now, there's a word that we used. I would like you to think about what that word is, and I'd like you to write in this part of your document, what is that particular piece of terminology? Could you write that down now? In this scene, the porter opened the door to Lennox and Macduff, and Macduff demands to see the king. Is thy master stirring? Macbeth then comes in and greets the two gentlemen. But look at how short these lines are. Look at how brief Macbeth is being in his speech. These short staccato bolts of speech. Not yet. I'll bring you to him. This is the door. He does. He did appoint so. 'Twas a rough night. Now let's just think about this for a second. Why do you think Macbeth speaks in such a truncated way in these early exchanges? When you compare this to his long, incredibly eloquent way of speaking in soliloquies, in iambic pentameter, speaking in rhyme often, this is not somebody who is short of amazing vocabulary, clearly. So why do you think he has truncated the speech so much, or Shakespeare has truncated Macbeth's speech so much? It's very different from the descriptive and metaphorical and emotional speeches that he used to give. So your task now is to think about, why do you think Shakespeare is making Macbeth speak so sharply and abruptly? It's the next task. I'd like you to fill that in here. Please do so now. Pause the video and come back. So let's talk about the weather. Remember, The weather plays an important part within Macbeth. We've had many references to it so far. The play opens with thunder, lightning, and rain. We have the conversation between Banquo and his son Fleance saying that the night was unruly. So the weather is an important part of the setting of the play. But why do you think Shakespeare is so interested in the weather? Let's have a look at what Lennox says when he gets to Macbeth's castle. The night has been unruly. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and, as they say, lamentings heard in the air, strange screams of death, and prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events, new hatched to the woeful time. The obscure bird clamoured the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake. So Lennox says on his way to the castle, the weather has been terrible. The chimneys were blown down because it was so windy. The wind almost sounded like there were people lamenting and crying, and there were strange screams of death in the air, of dire combustion, of fire, and confused events. There was birds screeching all night long, and some say that the earth even shook. There was an earthquake. So another task for you now. Take this passage, please. I'd like you to note down 2 quotes from this passage that summarizes the state of the weather. Try to memorize them yourself and see if you can recall them at the end of the lesson. And an extension task, what technique is Shakespeare using when he's talking about the natural world and weather? Pop this into this part of your document here, so that this is where the 2 quotes go. They don't need to be long quotes, just short lines, and see if you can remember them at the end of the lesson. And the extension task is just below that. Okay, now this is an important point which I'm sure you're all aware of, but it's worth repeating. A Jacobean audience at the time will have believed in a concept called the Great Chain of Being. This is the Great Chain of Being here, and essentially it is the natural order of things, with God at the top and rocks at the bottom. When everything is in its place, nature is fine. The sun's shining, everything's fantastic. When the Great Chain of Being is broken, that's when things start to go wrong. So we hear, or we see, within this scene, because Macbeth is low down on the Great Chain of Being, and he's tried to jump up to become a king, that the natural order of things has been upset. And we know it's been upset because the weather is appalling. The breaking of the Great Chain of Being essentially removes all normality from the world. So, the Jacobean audience would have firmly believed in the divine right of kings. That is the right for kings to be appointed by God and therefore could not and should not be usurped by anyone below them. And also the power of everyone and everything below God and the stars. So it was a good way of basically keeping people in order. If you were a peasant, you couldn't just become a nobleman or a prince. It was a way of keeping people in their place. But what Macbeth has done is he has ruined this great chain of being. He's broken the chain. And that's why the natural world's in turmoil. That's why there's earthquakes. That's why everything is becomes so tumultuous and windy and rainy and thundery. So the great chain of being is an important concept to be aware of. The task I'd like you to think about is, considering what you know about James I, why do you think the message of the divine right of kings and the great chain of being might have appealed to him as a new king? Think about what happened in 1604 and the public mood towards King James. Consider that question and pop your answer in this part of the document here. Okay, let's move on to the discovery of the body by Macduff, which is an important event. We know that any murder is horrific, but the murder of a king, which is known as regicide, the killing of a king, is something almost unbelievable, because you essentially, by killing the king, you're killing God's representation on earth. So let's have a quick look at some of these quotes here. "Oh, horror, 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 tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee. This is Macduff repeating how dreadful things are. Horror, 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 using the rule of three. The suggestion that the king is being murdered almost means that he can't speak about what has happened because it's so dreadful, it's so incomprehensible. So, if you go to your document now, here is the quote. Can you explain what it means in the right-hand side box? The next quote here, approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the Greek myth of Medusa. When you look at Medusa, you turn to stone. This is a reference to that story, meaning the very sight of the murdered king will petrify you, will turn you into stone. So dreadful is the sight. So once again, if you could write down your translation and your understanding in the bottom box here. And the final quote, most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple. So this is a direct reference to the divine right of kings here. As we know, the king was a representative of God, and this is the representation that is sacrilegious. It goes against religion, and by the killing of the king, it has broken open the Lord's anointed temple. It's an unholy act that essentially goes against God himself. So once again, if you can pop that explanation on the right hand side here. So what's important to recognize here is that Macduff's reaction is exactly the reaction that you would expect if you discovered the death of your king. It is almost so disgusting and so incomprehensible that he can't get his words together. He says that it's so disgraceful that he can hardly see it, and he says that it's gone against God himself. So we know that Macduff feels the right way. But if murdering the king is so unthinkable, what do we learn about Macbeth's character here and the fact that he's willing to carry out the act? Think about Macduff's reaction and now consider what we now think about Macbeth having done it. Think about that. Try and summarize what we now think about Macbeth's character and the fact that he's willing to commit regicide. And if you could try and summarize that in 3 sentences or fewer. So, the body's been discovered. In comes Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth says, what on earth's going on? Macduff replies, O gentle lady, it is not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell. So dreadful is the news that I have that I can't tell it to a woman because it would kill you immediately. Now this is a wonderful example of dramatic irony because we know as the audience that it was Lady Macbeth's idea to kill the king in the first place. It was her persuasive techniques that made Macbeth do it. And now Macduff is saying, oh, I can't tell you what's going on because you'll feel too upset by it. So we know that Lady Macbeth is absolutely the person who has controlled this whole event, and yet Macduff feels that she's not strong enough to hear it. So, 2 tasks for you to do here. What do Macduff's words tell us about the Jacobean attitude towards women? Could you please put that in this part of your document here? And as an extension, consider please Lady Macbeth seems far from gentle. Take what you know of her so far and note down what you think this might suggest about Shakespeare's own view of women. And that can go in this section here. Okay, well done. You've reached the end. You have 3 final tasks to do. Remember those quotes that I asked you to look at a few minutes ago from Lennox that described the unusual angry weather? What were they? See if you can recite them to yourself. Secondly, what does dramatic irony mean? And thirdly, what was the great chain of being? So the final 2 recall tasks, please pop them into these boxes. Send your document to your teacher. Best of luck. Stay safe.